Chapter 1. Porcelain and Lies. The clatter of ceramic on wood was a song Alara knew by heart. A fork dropped. A baby cried. A man laughed, loud and deep from his belly. She moved through the sounds, a ghost in a worn apron, her smile a carefully painted mask. The scent of burnt coffee and cheap grease clung to the air, a perfume she wore to prove she belonged. Here, in the grimy warmth of the daily grind, she wasn't a monster. She was just Ella, the quiet waitress who never got an order wrong. She refilled a sugar dispenser, her movements practiced and smooth, because anything else drew attention. Her existence depended on being forgettable. She watched a young couple in a corner booth, their fingers laced together over a half-eaten slice of pie. They were planning a future, their words soft and full of dreams she'd never allow herself to have. A sharp, bitter ache coiled in her chest. It was a familiar poison. She wanted it. Oh, how she wanted it. A life not spent looking over her shoulder. A touch that wasn't a threat. But she was a wolf in a world of sheep, and her hunger was a secret she would carry to her grave. Flowing from that thought, she turned away from the couple, the smile on her lips feeling brittle, like it might crack and fall to the floor. Mr. Henderson, a regular with a newspaper permanently attached to his hand, flagged her down. "More coffee, Ella, sweetheart?" he rasped, not looking up from the page. She nodded, her voice a practiced whisper. "Of course, Mr. Henderson." As she poured the steaming black liquid, her eyes snagged on a headline near his thumb. Lycan Prince continues kingdom-wide search. A cold dread, slick and immediate, slithered down her spine. It couldn't be. Could it? She forced her hand to remain steady. The story was something she'd heard whispered about for weeks. A prince from the old territories, the wild places humans pretended didn't exist, was sweeping through the border towns. The article was vague, talking about a lost artifact or a person of interest. But the rumors in the shadowed corners of the world, the ones she paid attention to, told a different story. He wasn't looking for an object. He was hunting for someone. Someone hiding. Someone who was not what they seemed. The coffee pot felt heavy, a stone in her hand. Is it possible he could be looking for me? "Something wrong, dear?" Mr. Henderson looked up, his brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Alara snapped her focus back, forcing the porcelain smile into place. It was a tremendous effort, a lie she had to tell with her entire body because her wolf wanted to bolt. "Just tired," she murmured, the words tasting like ash. "Long day." She retreated to the safety of the kitchen, the swinging door a flimsy shield against her rising panic. The prince's search felt like a net slowly closing around her quiet, fragile life. She had built this existence out of porcelain and lies, and she knew, with a certainty that stole her breath, that a creature of fang and fury was coming. And he wouldn't stop until he found what he was looking for. Continuing this line of thinking, she leaned against the cool metal of the refrigerator, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Why was she so afraid? Because she knew what happened when her kind was discovered. She carried the scars of that lesson on her soul. A brutal backstory etched in smoke and screams. This wasn't just about being found. It was about being erased. The prince represented a world she had fled, a fate she refused to accept. The rumors were a promise of violence, a threat that made her carefully constructed human life feel like a house of cards in a hurricane. The bell above the diner door jingled, announcing a new customer. But Alara didn't turn. For the first time in years, the simple sounds of her sanctuary didn't feel safe. They felt like a ticking clock. The casual laughter, the scrape of a chair, the sizzle of the grill, each tick was 1 second closer to the moment her mask would be ripped away, revealing the beast she kept chained inside. She had to be more careful. She had to be invisible. But a new, terrifying question began to claw at her mind. What if being invisible was no longer enough? That thought alone was enough to make her world tilt, leaving her clinging to the edge. Chapter 2. A Glimmer of the Beast. The afternoon sun, which should have felt warm and reassuring, instead felt like a spotlight. Alara left the diner with the prince's rumored hunt echoing in her thoughts, a persistent drumbeat of anxiety. She sought the noise of the town's annual Founders' Day festival, hoping to lose herself in the cheerful chaos of shouting vendors and laughing children. She bought a bag of roasted nuts, the warm paper a small comfort in her suddenly cold hands, and tried to pretend she was one of them. She tried to believe the lie she lived every single day. It happened in a flash of splintering wood and shrieking metal. A vendor's cart, overloaded with heavy crates of apples, broke loose from its mooring at the top of the hill. It careened down the cobblestone street, a runaway battering ram aimed directly at the thickest part of the crowd. Panic erupted. People scrambled, tripping over each other in a desperate wave of motion. But a little girl, no older than 5, stood frozen, a bright blue ribbon in her hair. She'd dropped her doll and had turned back for it, directly in the path of the speeding cart. Time seemed to warp, stretching and slowing. Alara saw the mother's horrified face, heard her strangled scream. She saw the cart's iron-bound wheel about to crush the small child. There was no time to think, no time to weigh the consequences or remember the rules that kept her alive. The instinct that lived in her blood, the protective, predatory core she suppressed with every breath, took over. She didn't run. She exploded. Consequently, the world became a blur of motion. She crossed the 20 feet between them in a heartbeat, a feat no human could manage. Her hand shot out, not to push the girl, but to stop the cart itself. Her palm connected with the thick oak siding with a sickening crack. The cart, weighing hundreds of pounds and moving with lethal momentum, shuddered to a dead stop. Wood splintered around her fist. Apples cascaded onto the cobblestones, rolling everywhere. And then, silence. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the screams. Every single eye was on her. Not with gratitude, not with relief, but with stunned, fearful disbelief. The mother snatched her child, pulling her away from Alara as if she were the danger. Whispers started ugly and sharp. "Did you see that? How did she—" "That's not possible." Alara looked down at her hand. There was no blood, not a single scratch, but the wood of the cart was imprinted with the perfect crushing shape of her fingers. The mask hadn't just cracked, it had shattered. She stumbled back, the weight of their stares a physical force. This was her deepest fear realized. She wasn't Ella, the quiet waitress, anymore. She was a question, an impossibility, a monster who had shown a glimmer of the beast within. She had to flee, because she knew what followed: whispers and suspicion. She could feel the story of her impossible strength spreading through the crowd like a virus, twisting and morphing into something monstrous. Did they know what she was? Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed her way through the gawking crowd, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. Just as she broke free, her eyes locked for a fraction of a second with a man leaning against a far-off building. He was tall, dressed in dark, unassuming clothes, but there was nothing unassuming about the silver pin on his lapel, a small, intricate wolf's head that glinted in the sun. His gaze wasn't shocked or confused. It was calculating. It was intrigued. And then, he melted back into the shadows of an alleyway, gone as if he were never there. The encounter left her skin crawling, a cold premonition that her mistake had not gone unnoticed. She hadn't just been seen by humans. She'd been spotted by a hunter. This realization sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The man with the pin wasn't just a random observer. He was a sign, a symbol of the very world she had abandoned. His presence here, on this day, at this exact moment, couldn't be a coincidence. It meant the rumors were true. It meant the hunt was no longer a distant threat whispered in a diner. It was here. Now. And she, in a single, reckless act of instinct, had just painted a giant target on her own back. The need to run was a primal scream in her soul, a desperate urge to shed her human skin and disappear into the wilderness. But where could she possibly go that they wouldn't find her now? Chapter 3. The scent of a night fell, but it brought no comfort. The festival lights cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist into menacing shapes. Alara tried to disappear again, to become a faceless silhouette in the throng of revelers, but the feeling of being watched clung to her like a second skin. The man with the wolf pin haunted her thoughts. His calculating stare burned into her memory. She was prey, and she could feel the predator circling. Every brush of a stranger's arm felt like a threat. Every loud noise made her flinch. She was trying to navigate a path toward the edge of the festival, toward the quiet darkness of the side streets, when a wall of muscle blocked her way. She tried to step around him, murmuring an apology, but he moved with her, a deliberate, predatory grace. In a hurry? A low voice rumbled, the sound vibrating through her bones. Alara's head snapped up. It was him. Not the man with the pin, but someone far more dangerous. He was impossibly tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the colorful lights of the festival behind him. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, carved from stone, but his eyes held her captive. They were the color of molten gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to strip away her skin, her clothes, her lies, and see the terrified wolf cowering beneath. A raw, primal energy rolled off him, an aura of ancient power and absolute authority that screamed Lycan. He smelled of pine after a storm, of cold mountain air, of something wild and untamed. It was a scent her soul recognized, and it terrified her. I have to go, she stammered, her voice thin. She tried to push past him, but his presence was an unbreachable fortress. I don't think so, he said, his voice dropping lower, a soft growl that was meant for her ears alone. You've caused quite a stir today, stopping a runaway cart with your bare hands. Very impressive. He said the word like it was a verdict, a condemnation. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. I don't know what you're talking about. The lie was weak, pathetic, even to her own ears. It was impossible to lie to those eyes. They saw everything. He knew. Following his silent scrutiny, he took a step closer, invading her space, his sheer size overwhelming. The sounds of the festival faded to a distant buzz. The world narrowed to the space between them, thick with an energy that crackled like lightning. It was more than fear. Beneath the terror, a strange, treacherous current of awareness sparked to life. A pull, a resonance. The part of her she kept chained recognized the part of him he wore like a crown. Alpha. The word screamed in her mind. He leaned down, his face so close she could feel the warmth of his breath on her skin. His golden eyes roamed her face, searching, dissecting. He was the prince. She knew it with a sickening certainty. The hunter had found his quarry. She held her breath, waiting for the killing blow, for the accusation that would end her life. But what he said next was worse. It was quieter, more intimate, and infinitely more damning. He inhaled softly, a predator sampling the air, and a faint, cruel smile touched his lips. He leaned in until his mouth was beside her ear, his whisper a hot, devastating secret. You smell like a lie. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. A truth he had plucked from the very air she breathed. Every pretense, every carefully constructed wall she had built around herself for years, crumbled to dust in that single moment. He didn't just suspect what she was. He knew she was hiding it. The lie was her scent, her signature, the one thing she couldn't scrub away. There was nowhere to run. There was no escape. She was trapped in the gaze of the Lycan prince, and her entire world, built on a foundation of fear and pretense, was about to be ripped apart. He had not only seen the glimmer of the beast, he had scented the soul of the pretender. Chapter 4. The Prince's Claim. His words hung in the air, a cage of sound locking her in place. You smell like a lie. Alara's every instinct screamed at her to run, to vanish into the thinning festival crowd, but his presence was a gravity well she could not escape. His golden eyes pinned her, dissecting her panic with a cold, terrifying calm. She took a half step back, a clumsy, stumbling motion that felt utterly useless. I don't know who you think I am, she whispered, the lie flimsy and thin. A humorless smile touched his lips. Oh, I think you do. He moved with the fluid deadliness of a panther, closing the small distance she'd gained. I am Kale. And you? He reached out, his fingers moving too fast to dodge, and tilted her chin up. His touch was like being branded, a searing heat that shot through her veins. You are an anomaly. Panic gave way to a surge of defiant anger. Who was he to corner her, to judge her? Get your hands off of me. His grip tightened, not enough to bruise, but enough to communicate absolute control. The girl who stops a runaway cart, the woman who smells of the wild but reeks of human fear. You hide what you are. His voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl. Show me. It wasn't a request. It was a command that resonated deep in her bones, a demand from an alpha that her suppressed wolf whimpered in answer to. She fought it, clamping down on the instinct to submit with all her will. But the pressure of his power, his sheer proximity, was too much. As a result, a tremor ran through her. Her vision swam, and the edges of the world sharpened with a wolf's clarity. The change she always feared, the one she fought daily, sparked against her will. A flash of brilliant, shimmering gold bled into her irises, overwhelming the simple brown. A man walking by stumbled, his eyes widening in shock as he caught the unnatural gleam of her gaze. He pointed, his mouth agape. Her eyes, that was all it took. The illusion of her humanity, shattered for all to see. Shame and fury warred within her, a sickening, hot tide. Kale saw the man's reaction, and a flicker of something, satisfaction, triumph, crossed his face. He released her chin, only to wrap his hand around her upper arm in an unbreakable grip. There it is, he murmured, his voice laced with dark victory. He began to pull her away from the festival lights, dragging her toward the shadowed maw of an alleyway. She struggled, digging her heels in, but it was like trying to fight a mountain. He was impossibly strong. No! Let me go! She hissed, her voice trembling with rage. People were staring, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. She was being stolen from her life in front of witnesses, yet no one moved to help her. Because what could they do against a man who radiated such primal authority? He was a king, and he was taking what he wanted. He leaned in close again, his previous whisper replaced by a possessive, chilling declaration that sealed her fate. You belong to me now, and little wolf, you're mine. Chapter 5. The Unworthy Mate. The moment they were swallowed by the alley's darkness, away from prying human eyes, Alara ripped her arm from his grasp. The sudden freedom was dizzying. She spun on him, her back hitting the cold, damp brick of the wall, her fear finally eclipsed by a towering wave of fury. You have no right, she snarled, the sound more animal than human. You can't just drag me away. You can't just claim me. Kyle watched her, his expression unreadable in the gloom. He didn't seem angry, just clinical, like a scientist observing a volatile specimen. I can, he stated, the simplicity of it more infuriating than any boast. Our law, our very nature gives me the right. The bond between us is undeniable. You feel it, don't you? Of course she felt it. It was a humming, electric current beneath her skin, a terrifying pull toward this man who had just destroyed her life. It was a connection she had never known, a sense of fated recognition that made her want to scream. But admitting it felt like surrender. There is no bond, she spat. There is nothing between us but this madness. Following that declaration, A flicker of something raw and hot finally broke through his composure. His golden eyes blazed. "Do not lie to me again," he bit out, taking a step forward that forced her to press herself harder against the wall. "I have been searching for you for months, for the other half of my soul. I find you hiding in the dirt, pretending to be a fragile human, reeking of fear and weakness. You think this is what I wanted? A mate who is ashamed of her own blood?" His words were like daggers, each one striking at the heart of her deepest insecurities. He was supposed to be her fated mate, the one being in the universe created for her, and he was looking at her with nothing but contempt. The bitter ache in her chest intensified, a physical pain now. "Then let me go," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "If I'm such a disappointment, then leave me to my pathetic life. I don't want your world. I don't want you." "You think I want this?" he shot back, his voice rising to a furious growl. He gestured vaguely between them. "The Fates have a sick sense of humor. A prince of the Lycans cannot be bonded to a coward. You are unfit, unworthy of the title, unworthy of me." He turned his back on her, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. "The bond is a mistake. I reject it. I reject you." The moment the words left his mouth, a searing, white-hot agony erupted in Alara's chest. It was a physical tearing, as if fate itself were being ripped in two inside her. She gasped, clutching at her sternum, the pain so intense it stole her breath and brought tears to her eyes. It was the bond, protesting its own denial. It was the sound of her soul screaming. Kyle flinched, his own hand briefly touching his chest, and she knew with certainty that he felt it too. The rejection was a wound that scarred them both, a brutal severing that left an open, bleeding emptiness in its wake. Chapter 6. The Bleeding Protector. The agonizing pain in her chest slowly subsided to a dull, throbbing ache. Ilara was left gasping in the alley, the echoes of Kale's rejection ringing in her ears. He stood with his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the distant festival lights. He had rejected her. He had destroyed her life and then deemed her unworthy of his. A hollow despair began to settle over her, colder and heavier than any fear she had ever known. She was truly alone. Suddenly, Kale's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that had nothing to do with her. "Get down," he ordered, his voice a blade of ice. Before she could question him, they came from the shadows. 3 figures, moving with a silent, unnatural speed. They weren't human. Their eyes glowed with a faint, predatory silver light in the darkness, and the air filled with the scent of rival wolves, a smell of damp earth and bloodlust. They held curved, wicked-looking daggers that gleamed with a sickly green substance along the edges. Poison. Her new goal was instantaneous and primal. Survive. Ilara scrambled back, pressing herself into the grimy corner of the alley, making herself a small target. The assassins ignored her. Their focus, their killing intent, was entirely on Kyle. They flowed around him, a dance of death, their blades flashing. What happened next was terrifying. Kyle didn't just fight. He became something else entirely. The civilized prince vanished, replaced by a feral creature of instinct and rage. His growl deepened into a chest-rattling roar. His hands shifted, fingers elongating into wicked black claws that tore through the air. Fangs descended over his lips. He moved in a blur of violence, not just defending himself, but attacking with a savagery that was breathtaking. He was a force of nature, a storm of fury unleashed. He tore into the first assassin, his claws ripping through flesh and bone. The second lunged, and Kale met him head-on, their bodies slamming together with a sound like a thunderclap. But the third attacker was clever. While Kyle was occupied, the third assassin feinted toward him, then suddenly changed direction, his silver eyes locking onto Ilara. He saw her as the weak point. The assassin lunged for her. Time slowed. She saw the green-coated dagger arcing toward her throat. She was going to die. but then a black shape intercepted the blow. Kyle, bleeding from a deep gash on his side, had thrown himself in front of her. The poisoned dagger sank deep into his shoulder. He roared in pain and fury, and with a final, desperate surge of strength, he snapped the attacker's neck. The other two, seeing their leader fall, vanished back into the shadows as quickly as they had appeared. Silence descended once more, broken only by Kale's ragged, pained breaths. He stumbled, leaning heavily against the wall, his hand clamped over the dagger still embedded in his shoulder. The poison was already working, black veins were spreading from the wound. He had rejected her. He had called her unworthy. And he had just taken a poisoned blade meant for her. He couldn't let her die, even if he didn't want her. She woke up to the scent of antiseptic herbs and clean linen. The hard brick of the alley was gone, replaced by a soft mattress. Her eyes fluttered open to see a canopy of dark, rich wood above her. She was in a lavish bedchamber, a fire crackling in a stone hearth nearby. Kyle stood by the window, his back to her. He was shirtless, a clean white bandage wrapped tightly around his shoulder, and another around his ribs. He turned as he heard her stir, his golden eyes weary but burning with an unyielding intensity. "You're awake," he stated, his voice flat. Where am I?" she whispered. "My chambers," he said, walking toward the bed. He stopped a few feet away, a predator keeping his distance. "The assassins will be back. They weren't trying to kill me. They were trying to take you." The implication was a cold shock. "Why?" "That's what I intend to find out." He looked down at her, his expression a mask of grim resolve. There was no warmth, no tenderness. Only the cold, hard logic of a prince protecting an asset. He had been unable to let her die, and now she was a problem he had to solve. "You are a danger to yourself and a liability to me. I cannot allow you to run free." He took another step closer, his shadow falling over her, and delivered his ultimatum, his voice a low, unbreakable vow. "You will stay here. You will stay where I can protect you, or you will die. The choice is yours." Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. Ilara's world had shrunk to the size of a gilded cage. Kale's fortress was carved from the heart of a mountain, a place of breathtaking, brutalist beauty. Sunlight streamed through vast, arched windows, illuminating tapestries that depicted epic hunts and ancient battles. The air smelled of wood smoke, old stone, and a clean, sharp ozone that was the scent of raw power. She was a prisoner in a palace, given silken gowns to wear and rich foods to eat, but the stares of the other Lycans were the real bars of her cell. They watched her with an unnerving stillness, their eyes, in shades of gold, green, and amber, missing nothing. They were predators, and she was a strange, wounded creature brought into their den. The whispers followed her through the great halls, slithering things that spoke of her weakness, her human scent, her unworthiness. She wasn't just an outsider. She was an insult, a living symbol of their prince's inexplicable choice. Her attempts to remain invisible, a tactic that had served her for years in the human world, were useless here. Here, her quietness was mistaken for fear, and her fear was mistaken for fragility. Consequently, she felt more exposed than ever before. In the human world, she hid a secret. Here, her secret was known, and it was the source of their contempt. Kale was a constant, brooding presence. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his gaze on her, a heavy weight of possession and frustration. He had saved her, and now he was stuck with her, a political liability he was forced to protect. She was a living testament to the bond he had openly rejected, and her presence in his court was a source of constant tension. The first open challenge came during a midday meal in the feasting hall. A tall, silver-haired Lycan named Valerius, whose smile was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice, approached the high table where she sat in suffocating silence beside Kale. "My prince," Valerius said, his voice a smooth, mocking purr as he bowed. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, slid to Ilara. "I see you've acquired a new pet. Does it do any tricks?" The insult was so blatant, so sharp, it stole the air from Alara's lungs. Humiliation burned hot in her cheeks. Before she could even flinch, a low, guttural sound vibrated through the stone floor. It was a growl, deep and menacing, ripped from Kale's chest. The entire hall fell silent. Every Lycan froze, their attention snapping to the high table. Kale didn't even look at Valerius. He continued to cut his meat, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the knife. "The next time you speak of her," Kyle said, his voice dangerously soft, yet it carried to every corner of the vast hall, "will be the last time you speak at all." The threat was absolute. Valerius's smile tightened, and with another shallow bow he retreated, his pale eyes promising future trouble. The message had been sent. Alara was under the prince's protection. But the act didn't feel like a rescue. It felt like a branding. He had silenced the mockery, yes, but in doing so, he had only reinforced her status as his possession. He had not defended her honor. He had defended his own. She was his. And what was his, no one else was allowed to break. The gilded bars of her cage had just become thicker, forged from the steel of his possessive fury. Chapter 8. The Wolf Within. The next morning, Kale dragged her not to the feasting hall, but to a stark, open-air training ground paved with hard-packed earth. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil. 2 guards stood at the perimeter, their arms crossed, their faces impassive. He threw a simple tunic and leggings at her feet. "Change," he ordered. "Your lessons begin now." Her lesson, it turned out, was a singular, terrifying objective. She was to call her wolf. She was to embrace the very thing she had spent her entire life caging. "No," she said, the word barely a whisper. "This is not a request," Kale stated, circling her like a wolf himself. "The assassins came for you once, they will again. This weakness," he gestured to her, to the trembling of her hands, to the fear in her eyes, "makes you a target. It makes me vulnerable. You will learn to control your power, or it will get you killed." He was right, and she hated him for it. He was forcing her to confront her greatest trauma because it was politically inconvenient for him. He pushed her, prodded her, trying to ignite her anger, hoping it would trigger the change. He insulted her, belittled her human fragility, mocked her fear. For hours she resisted, her mind a fortress against his attacks. But he was relentless. "What are you so afraid of?" he finally snarled, grabbing her shoulders. "It's a part of you. Why do you hate it so much?" His touch, the raw power in his voice, finally broke through her defenses. The fortress crumbled, and the memory she kept locked away flooded her. A flash of fire, the smell of burning wood and singed fur, the sound of her own agonized screams as a child, not from pain, but from the terror of the beast erupting from within her, the horror of losing control, of becoming something monstrous and unrecognizable, the fear on her parents' faces. It all came rushing back. Following this surge of memory, a sob tore from her throat, raw and broken. She collapsed to her knees, the fight draining out of her completely. "I can't," she wept, the words ripped from the deepest part of her soul. "You don't understand. The first time it happened, I destroyed everything. I hurt people." She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her entire body shaking with the force of her remembered terror. "It's a monster. I'm a monster." She expected him to scoff, to call her weak again, but for the first time, a different expression crossed his face. The anger was gone, replaced by a flicker of something she couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It was a sharp, piercing understanding. He crouched down in front of her, his golden eyes locking onto hers. The silence stretched, filled only by her ragged breaths. He didn't offer comfort. He offered a truth that was far harsher and far more vital. "You're not a monster," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "And you're not weak." He reached out, his thumb brushing a tear from her cheek, the brief touch sending a jolt through her. "You're afraid of yourself. And until you conquer that fear, you will never be whole. His words struck her with more force than any physical blow, leaving her kneeling in the dirt with a devastating new clarity. Chapter 9. The Alpha's Fury. The grand banquet was a performance of power. The feasting hall blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, casting flickering glows on jeweled goblets and polished silver. The air was thick with the smells of roasted boar, spiced wine, and the underlying musky scent of the powerful Lycans who filled the chamber. Alara sat beside Kale, a silent doll dressed in emerald silk, feeling the weight of 100 predatory stares. This was Kale's court, a gathering of alphas from allied territories, and she was the main spectacle. Kale was a different person tonight. He was the prince, regal and commanding, engaged in low, serious conversations with the alphas who approached his table. He ignored her completely, but his arm rested on the back of her chair, a subtle but unmistakable declaration of ownership. She felt trapped, a pawn in a political game she didn't understand. She sipped her wine, wishing she could become invisible again. From this state of unease, her attention was drawn to Lord Valerius as he approached. He moved with a snake-like grace, his silver hair gleaming in the candlelight. He stopped beside her chair, completely ignoring Kyle, his cold eyes fixed on her. "You look beautiful tonight, my dear," he murmured, his voice a silken insinuation. "Though a bit out of your element, wouldn't you say? Like a field mouse at a convocation of eagles." Before she could respond, he reached out and laid his hand on her bare shoulder. His touch was icy cold, a violation that made her skin crawl. It was a deliberate provocation, a direct challenge. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. Kale didn't speak. He didn't warn. He moved. The heavy oak table flipped, sending plates and goblets crashing to the stone floor with a deafening roar. In the same motion, he launched himself at Valerius. A feral snarl ripped through the now silent hall, a sound of pure, unrestrained fury that promised death. His eyes were no longer just gold. They were blazing suns of rage. He slammed Valerius against a stone pillar, his claws extending, his fangs bared. The entire court was frozen, watching their prince on the verge of murder. Two of Kale's guards finally managed to pull him off, their faces strained with effort. Kale fought them, his chest heaving, his murderous gaze still locked on the shaken but smirking Valerius. He had lost control. For her. The thought was terrifying, and, in a secret, shameful corner of her heart, it sent a dizzying thrill through her. In that moment of pure, primal rage, he hadn't been a prince rejecting a bond. He had been an alpha protecting his mate. Later, the banquet in ruins, she found him in a deserted corridor, pacing like a caged beast. He stopped when he saw her, his body still radiating a dangerous energy. She was humiliated, furious at being the center of such a violent spectacle. "What was that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You acted like a savage." In 2 long strides, he was in front of her, backing her against the cold stone wall. He slammed his hands on the wall on either side of her head, trapping her. His face was inches from hers, his eyes still burning with a possessive fire that stole her breath. He was all predator, the scent of his rage a heady, intoxicating thing in the enclosed space. She could feel the heat rolling off his body, see the pulse hammering in his throat. "He touched you," Kyle snarled, his voice a low, guttural vibration that she felt in her bones. The anger wasn't gone. It was just focused, honed to a razor's edge, and aimed entirely at the memory of Valerius's hand on her skin. He put his hands on what is mine. The words were a brand, a claim, a promise of violence. It wasn't a confession of love. It was a declaration of ownership so absolute, so primal, it left no room for argument. She was his to protect, his to control, and his to keep. And heaven help anyone who dared to forget it. Chapter 10. The Deadly Bond. The aftermath of the banquet left a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the mountain winds. Kale's explosive possessiveness had terrified Alara, but it had also planted a treacherous seed of hope. It was a contradiction she couldn't solve. Why would he reject her so brutally, only to defend her with such suicidal fury? The question led her to the fortress's archives, a circular chamber filled with the scent of old leather and drying herbs, presided over by an ancient she-wolf named Lyra, whose eyes were clouded with cataracts but saw more than most. Alara asked about the bond, her voice hesitant. She spoke of its painful rejection, of the prince's cold anger. Lyra listened, her wrinkled face impassive. Then she sighed, a sound like rustling leaves. "You think the prince's cruelty is for you?" the old wolf rasped. "Child, his cruelty is a shield. It is meant to protect you both." From this opening, Lyra revealed the fortress's darkest secret. A curse, laid upon Kale's bloodline generations ago by a vengeful sorceress. It was a poison that targeted the sacred rite of the mating bond. If a prince of the royal line marked his true mate, the surge of power, the final sealing of their souls, would not bring bliss. It would shatter his sanity, plunging him into a feral, bloodthirsty madness from which there was no return. Kale's own father had suffered this fate, becoming a mindless beast who had to be put down. Kale had watched it happen. The revelation struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't that he thought she was unworthy. It was that the bond itself was a death sentence for his mind. His rejection wasn't an insult. It was an act of desperate self-preservation. He had been pushing her away, being cruel and cold, because the alternative, giving in to the pull between them, was a path to his own destruction. She felt a wave of guilt so profound it made her dizzy. She had seen his anger as an attack on her, but it was a war he was fighting with himself, with his own desires. Later that night, she found him in the armory, his hands wrapped around the hilt of a great sword, his knuckles white. A strange heat radiated from him, a feverish energy that spoke of a barely contained struggle. "Lyra told me," she said softly. Kyle didn't turn. "Then you know why you should stay away from me." His voice was a low, strained growl. "Every moment you are near, the bond pulls. It wants to be sealed. It wants to destroy me." "Is that why you saved me?" she whispered. "To torture yourself with a mate you can never have." He finally turned, and the agony in his golden eyes made her heart ache. He looked like a man on the rack, torn between duty and a desire that was literally poison to him. "I saved you because I am incapable of doing anything else," he confessed, his voice raw. He took a staggering step toward her, his body trembling with the effort of holding himself back. The madness. "I watched it consume my father. I will not become that." He was close now, the feverish heat of his skin warming her own. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, shaking. "But when I see you," he growled, a sound of pure torment. "When I scent you, every instinct in me screams to claim what is mine." His gaze dropped to her throat, to the place where his mark should be. A fevered, desperate light entered his eyes. "Even madness," he whispered, the sound a ragged promise, "would be worth you." Chapter 11. The Human Betrayal. Kale's confession left Alara reeling in a world without solid ground. He wanted her enough to contemplate insanity. Yet, they were trapped, their fated love a curse that would destroy him. This new, terrible knowledge only deepened her prison. She was the key to his destruction, a walking temptation he was forced to protect. The weight of it was suffocating. The revelation did not bring them closer. It created a new, more tragic chasm between them. The final blow to her world came not from a Lycan, but from the human life she had lost. Lord Valerius requested her presence in the library, a smug, predatory glint in his pale eyes. Kale was against it, but refusing would be a political misstep. Flanked by guards, Alara met him, her posture rigid with distrust. Valerius didn't waste time with pleasantries. He was enjoying this far too much. "You must be wondering how our mutual friends found you in that quaint little town," he purred, circling a large oak table. After all your efforts to hide, it takes a special kind of intimacy to know someone's deepest secret. Dread coiled in her stomach. What are you talking about? Oh, come now, you didn't really think those assassins stumbled upon you by accident, did you? He laughed, a low, cruel sound. We had help. From your world. He slid a small, familiar object across the polished wood. It was a silver locket, one she had given to her best friend Sarah on her last birthday in the human world. Her heart stopped. Flowing from this terrible evidence, the story came out in a torrent of sadistic detail. Sarah, her childhood friend, the only person she had ever confided in about feeling different, had sold her out. For a bag of gold, she had told Valerius's spies about the quiet waitress with a secret, the girl with strange reflexes and an aura of fear. She had pointed them right to her. The betrayal was absolute. It was a poison more potent than any on an assassin's dagger. The Lycans saw her as weak and unworthy. And now, the one human she had trusted had tossed her to the wolves for money. The foundation of her entire existence, the belief that at least her human life had held one true connection, crumbled into dust. She belonged nowhere. She was wanted by no one. She was a freak to one world and a commodity to the other. A choked, strangled sound escaped her lips. Valerius smiled, his work done. Alara turned and fled, not just from the library, but from everything. She ran past her guards, ignoring their shouts. She sprinted through the stone corridors of the fortress, her mind a whirlwind of pain and despair. She had to get out. She couldn't be the curse that broke Kyle. She couldn't live among people who despised her. She couldn't exist in a world where her only friend would sell her life so cheaply. She burst out of a side gate and into the biting wind of the mountainside, running blindly into the dense, dark forest. Tears streamed down her face, freezing in the cold air. She ran with no destination, fueled only by the desperate need to escape the wreckage of her life. She had to get away. But as she ran, a familiar, agonizing pain flared in her chest, the burning, pulling sensation of the bond. It was stretching, screaming at the distance she was putting between them, and she knew, with a sickening certainty, that he could feel it too. Her desperate flight was a beacon, a scream of terror that was dragging the prince directly to her. Chapter 12. The Price of Protection. The forest was a maze of black trunks and tangled roots. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every snap of a twig sent a fresh spike of fear through her. Alara ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead, driven by the storm of betrayal in her heart. The pain of the bond was a relentless fire in her chest, a physical manifestation of her connection to a man she was desperately trying to flee. It was a cruel, beautiful agony. She stumbled into a small clearing, the moonlight painting the frosted ground in shades of silver and gray. She finally allowed herself to stop, gasping for breath, leaning against a massive pine tree. The silence of the woods pressed in, amplifying the screaming chaos in her mind. Sarah's face smiling and treacherous, Valerius's cruel smirk, Cale's tormented eyes. It was too much. That's when they attacked. Not with the subtlety of the alleyway assassins, but with the brutal confidence of a pack cornering its prey. 4 of them this time, their silver eyes glowing with malice in the dark. They had been waiting for her. Valerius had planned it all, knowing the news of the betrayal would make her run, would make her isolated and vulnerable. She scrambled backward, a scream catching in her throat as the first one lunged. But before its claws could reach her, a black, furred missile slammed into its side, sending it flying with a pained yelp. Kyle was there. He had followed the pull of the bond, his face a mask of primal fury. He didn't look like a prince now. He looked like a god of vengeance, his golden eyes blazing in the moonlight. The fight was a whirlwind of savage violence. Cale was magnificent and terrifying, a storm of claws and fangs against the 4 attackers. But they were prepared for him. They fought as a unit, their poisoned blades flashing, forcing him to stay on the defensive to keep them away from Alara. He was already injured, his movements a fraction slower than they should have been. One of the assassins fainted, drawing his attention, while another dropped low and slashed at his leg, hobbling him. Kyle roared in pain and rage, but he never stopped placing his body between her and the threat. He was a living shield, taking cuts and slashes meant for her. It was in that moment, watching him bleed for her, that the last of her walls came crashing down. The anger, the fear, the resentment, it all melted away, replaced by a love so fierce and so painful, it felt like it was tearing her apart. The fatal blow came swiftly. As Kale dispatched one assassin, another lunged past his guard, its dagger aimed directly at Alara's heart. Kale spun, his eyes wide with horror, and threw himself in the path of the blade with a desperate roar. The dagger, long and coated in the same green poison, plunged deep into his side. A terrible, guttural sound of agony was ripped from his throat. The remaining assassins, their mission seemingly complete, melted back into the trees. Kale collapsed to his knees, his hands weakly trying to pull the blade from his ribs. Dark blood pulsed around the wound, sizzling where it touched the poison. His breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. He was dying. He was dying for her. Alara scrambled to his side, her hands hovering over his wound, unsure of what to do. Tears she didn't know she had left to cry streamed down her face. "No, no, no, Kyle," she choked out, her voice breaking. All the unspoken feelings, all the desperate emotions poured out of her in a single, broken confession. "Don't you die. Please, don't leave me. I love you." He slumped against her, his body trembling, his life fading with every ragged breath. His golden eyes, now clouded with pain, found hers. A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. He was barely audible, his voice a strained, desperate whisper. "Say it again." Chapter 13. The Wounded Alliance. Kale's recovery was a slow, agonizing process. The assassin's poison was potent, a vile concoction designed to cripple a Lycan from the inside out. Alara rarely left his side, watching as Lyra applied poultices and forced foul-smelling herbal remedies down his throat. The prince, reduced to a feverish, weakened state, fought the toxins with a grim tenacity that awed her. Watching him, so vulnerable, yet so unyielding, solidified a change within her. The girl who ran was gone, burned away in the fire of the ambush. In her place was a woman with a purpose. When Kale was finally lucid, his golden eyes sharp and clear once more, she met his gaze without flinching. "The rivals who hired Sarah's betrayal? The ones who sent the assassins? They used me to get to you," she said, her voice steady and hard. "They see me as your weakness. I won't be that anymore." Kale studied her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "What are you proposing?" "An alliance," she stated, the word tasting of power on her tongue. "You and I, we stop them. Together." It was a declaration, not a plea. She was no longer a victim in his story. She was choosing to be a warrior. A flicker of something that looked like admiration crossed his features before he masked it. Because this was his only real choice, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. An alliance. This new pact changed everything. The training resumed, but the dynamic had shifted. There was no more taunting, no more prodding a frightened animal. Now, they were partners preparing for war. Kyle, still not at full strength, taught her strategy, while his top general, a scarred veteran named Lycan, taught her to fight. She wasn't a natural, but she was driven. The fear of her wolf was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the fear of losing Kale was greater. One afternoon, Kale took over her combat lesson. "Lycan is teaching you to fight like a soldier," he said, circling her on the training grounds. "You need to learn to fight like a wolf." He attacked without warning, and she was forced to defend herself against him. It wasn't a lesson, it was a spar, a brutal, intimate dance. He was faster, stronger, but she was learning to anticipate, to use her smaller size to her advantage. He lunged and she dropped, sweeping his legs out from under him. He hit the ground with a grunt, but he was so quick he managed to pull her down with him. They rolled on the hard-packed earth, a tangle of limbs and strained muscles. She ended up on her back, him pinning her wrists above her head, his body caging hers. They were both panting, sweat beading on their skin. The scent of pine and ozone from him was overwhelming, intoxicating. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with their fight. His gaze dropped to her mouth, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. Her own hands, which had been fighting him, relaxed. Her fingers brushed against his, a tentative, lingering touch that sent a jolt through them both. The world narrowed to the few inches between their faces, their breaths mingling, the line between combat and caress blurring into nothing. Chapter 14. The Fire of the Bond. The unspoken thing that had sparked between them on the training ground festered in the following days. It was a storm gathering on the horizon, a pressure building in the air that made every glance, every accidental touch, feel like a lit fuse. Denial was no longer possible. The bond, rejected and wounded, was still there. A burning, undeniable fire that drew them together, even as the curse threatened to tear them apart. The storm finally broke on a wild, windy night that rattled the windows of the fortress. Cale found her in the library, staring into the fireplace, tracing the patterns of the flames. He didn't speak, just came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar, heated weight. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of what they could never be. "I hate this," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "This curse, this fate that makes me a danger to you." "Do you think I do not?" he rasped, his voice rough with a pain that mirrored her own. "To have found you, only to know that claiming you would be the end of me." He trailed off, the agony in his tone saying more than words ever could. That shared vulnerability was the final spark. He turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with a reverence that made her tremble. "Alara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry collision, a release of all the pent-up fury, fear, and forbidden longing that had raged between them. It was the kiss of a condemned man seeking his last taste of salvation. She answered him with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. This was madness. This was reckless, and she didn't care. The kiss deepened, moving from the library to his chambers in a blur of desperate motion, shedding clothes and inhibitions along the way. Their passion was a storm, dark and consuming, a frantic attempt to seize a moment of solace in their cursed reality. This was not the gentle love she saw in the diner. This was a raw, elemental claiming, a blaze of sensation that threatened to burn them both to ash. In the heat of the moment, lost to the fire of the bond, he moved over her, his eyes blazing with a feral, possessive light she had never seen before. He lowered his head to her neck, his hot breath ghosting over her skin. She felt the sharp prick of his fangs against her throat. He was going to mark her. He was going to seal their bond and condemn himself to madness right here, right now. A part of her, the wild wolf part she had so long denied, cried out for it, yearned for that final, absolute connection. But then, with a guttural roar of self-loathing and agony, he pulled away. He scrambled off the bed as if burned, stumbling back until he hit the far wall, his body racked with tremors. He was panting, his eyes wild with the horror of what he had almost done. The curse, the face of his mad father, had risen up between them. He looked at her, his expression shattered, a man torn in two. "If I mark you," he growled, the words ripped from his very soul, "I lose everything." Chapter 15. The Stolen Queen. The aftermath of their passion was a landscape of quiet devastation. Cale's agonized words echoed in the space between them, a final, brutal reminder of the curse that ruled their lives. They had crossed a line, and now the chasm separating them felt wider and more impossible than ever. He couldn't touch her, couldn't give in to the bond that screamed for completion without sacrificing his sanity. And she couldn't ask him to. There was no solution. There was only the aching, impossible love that now lay exposed and wounded between them. The next day, a fragile, unspoken truce held. Cale threw himself into war preparations with a grim, single-minded focus, his way of running from the emotional wreckage. Alara, feeling lost and raw, sought refuge in the one place that felt like neutral ground, the vast, quiet archives. She needed to understand the enemy, to learn about Valerius and the rival packs who sought to destroy them. If she couldn't be Cale's mate, she would be his ally. She would be his sword. She was engrossed in an old, leather-bound tome detailing pack lineages when a subtle shift in the air made the hairs on her arms stand up. The scent of the archives, old paper, and dried herbs was suddenly tainted by something else. A faint, sweet, cloying smell. Before she could place it, a cloth was clamped over her mouth and nose from behind. She gasped, inhaling the scent, and her muscles immediately went limp. Her shifter senses, the ones that should have warned her, felt dull and distant, muffled by a silver-laced powder. Panic flared, but her body wouldn't obey. She was being dragged backward, her heels scraping silently on the stone floor. She saw two figures, cloaked and masked, their movements swift and professional. Valerius's men. They had breached the heart of the fortress. They had come for her. Her mind screamed Cale's name, but her lips wouldn't move. Her limbs were heavy and useless. The world tilted, the edges of her vision blurring into a dark, swirling tunnel as they pulled her into a hidden passageway behind a bookshelf. Meanwhile, Cale was in the war room, his generals spread around a massive table map. But his focus was gone. A cold, gnawing unease was settling in his gut. The bond. It felt wrong, muted, distant, and terrified. It was a discordant scream at the edge of his senses. "Alara," he murmured, his head snapping up. He pushed back from the table, his chair crashing to the floor. Something's wrong. He strode from the war room, his pace quickening with every step. He followed the faint thread of their connection, a thread that was rapidly growing thinner, weaker. He burst into the archives to find it empty, an overturned chair and a scattered pile of books the only sign of a struggle. But her scent was there, thick with terror, and beneath it, the faint, hostile scent of rival wolves. He had failed. He had built a fortress, surrounded her with guards, and they had taken her anyway. They had stolen the other half of his soul from right under his nose. The control he had fought so hard to maintain, the princely composure, the shield against the curse, all of it shattered in an instant. A grief and rage so profound, so absolute, consumed him. The last vestiges of the prince were burned away, leaving only the alpha, the feral, wounded mate. He threw his head back, and a roar of pure, apocalyptic fury erupted from his chest, a sound that shook the very foundations of the mountain. It was not a call for a meeting. It was not a strategic move. It was the sound of war beginning. Chapter 16. The Price of Love. Alara awoke to the chilling bite of cold stone and the metallic scent of old blood. She was in a dungeon, the air thick and heavy, the only light a sliver from a high barred window. Chunks of rough-hewn rock protruded from the walls, one of which was a deep, unsettling black, obsidian, a stone known to dampen Lycan power. Her limbs felt heavy, her spirit crushed under a mountain of guilt. She had been the bait, and her desperate flight had led the wolves right to their prey. The clang of a heavy bar being lifted echoed through the gloom, and Lord Valerius entered her cell. He looked immaculate in a dark tunic, a stark contrast to the filth of the dungeon. His smile was a thin, cruel line. "I do apologize for the accommodations," he said, his voice dripping with false courtesy. "But a prize such as yourself requires a certain security." He began to circle her, his steps slow and deliberate. "You see, the prince's bond to you is a sickness, a weakness in a royal line already tainted by a curse of madness. I am simply the cure." Before she could spit out a reply, guards dragged a second figure into the cell and threw him to the floor. Cale. He was battered and bloody, his wrists bound in thick silver chains that sizzled against his skin, sapping his strength. He lifted his head, and his golden eyes, though clouded with pain, found hers. The look in them was one of pure, unadulterated fury, directed not at her, but at Valerius. This was the true torture. Valerius paced before the captured prince, his voice a weapon. She must be quite special to have a prince risk his sanity for her, he mused, tapping a silver-tipped cane against Kyle's shoulder, making him flinch. And yet, what a pity he never truly wanted you. He turned his cold gaze on Alara. Did you know he rejected you? The moment he found you, he cast you aside. He told his entire court you were unworthy. The words were poison, twisting the truth into a weapon to break them both. Alara saw Cale strain against his chains, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Every word Valerius spoke was a fresh stab of guilt in her heart. He was right. She had been a disappointment, a burden. Her weakness, her fear, her very existence had brought this proud, powerful prince to his knees in a filthy dungeon. This was all her fault. I am cleansing the packs of this weakness, Valerius continued, his voice rising with zealous fire. We will perform a ritual. We will sever the bond between you for good. And then, with his last connection to this world gone, he will follow his father into madness, and I will take his place. He leaned down, grabbing Alara's chin, forcing her to look at the broken form of her mate. Look at him. This is the price of his love for you. He was a prince, and you have reduced him to this. Valerius's final taunt was a vicious whisper meant to shatter what was left of her spirit. Even your prince rejected you. In the end, little wolf, you belong to no one. Chapter 17. The Fading Spark. After Valerius left, the silence in the cell was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. Cale was a heap on the floor, his breathing shallow, the silver chains eating away at his vitality. Alara crawled to him, her own aches and pains forgotten. She touched his face, his skin unnervingly cool. His eyes were closed, his handsome features slack with pain and exhaustion. All the fire, all the arrogant power was gone. He was simply a man, broken and bleeding at her feet. Hope, she realized, was a fragile, stupid thing. And hers was gone. They had lost. Valerius would perform his ritual, Cale would be lost to madness or death, and she would be nothing. An empty vessel, a failed mate. Her entire life had been a series of cages, the cage of her fear, the gilded cage of Cale's fortress, and now this final stone cage. There were no more escapes. A new and terrifying sensation began to creep over her. The bond, the fiery, demanding connection that had been a constant source of either pain or passion, was fading. It had always been a humming warmth at the base of her soul, a tether that connected her to him across any distance. Now that warmth was turning to ice. The hum was becoming a faint, thready whisper. It was like watching the last ember of a fire die, the light and heat receding into a cold, permanent darkness. As his life force dwindled, so did their connection. The thought of it being gone forever was an agony worse than any blade. It was the prospect of a true and final loneliness, an amputation of the soul. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She couldn't lose him. She couldn't lose this. Kyle, she whispered, her voice cracking. She shook his shoulder gently. Kyle, wake up. Please. His eyelids fluttered but did not open. His breathing was so shallow now she could barely see his chest move. The spark of the bond flickered violently, threatening to extinguish completely. This was it, the lowest point. The moment where all seemed lost. Trapped, defeated. With the man she loved dying in her arms and the very essence of their connection dissolving into nothing. She had nothing left to offer, no strength, no plan, no hope. All she had was a choice a choice made in the face of absolute despair, a vow whispered into the encroaching darkness when there was no reason to believe it would matter. She leaned down, her lips brushing his ear, her tears falling onto his cold skin. It wasn't a confession born of passion, but a desperate anchor thrown against the tide of oblivion, a final act of defiance against the dying of the light. She whispered the words, a promise to his fading soul and to her own. I choose you. Chapter 18. Dark Night of the Soul. The words, I choose you, hung in the dead air of the cell, a futile prayer against the encroaching silence. Kyle remained still, his life and their bond dwindling to a near imperceptible thread. The cold of the stone floor seeped into Alara's bones, a physical manifestation of the absolute hopelessness that had consumed her. She was empty, utterly and completely broken. She had failed him. Her fear, her lifelong habit of hiding, had rendered her useless. In the crushing darkness, with nothing left to lose, her mind turned inward. She was forced to face the one thing she had spent her entire life running from: the wolf, the monster. The memory she had fought for years rose unbidden, no longer a fleeting flash but a vivid, horrifying tableau. She saw herself as a child, small and terrified, the first shift tearing through her like a lightning strike. She remembered the fire, not a real fire, but the searing, explosive heat of her own untamed power. She remembered the feeling of her bones breaking and reshaping, the agony eclipsed only by the terror. And she remembered the screams of her parents, a sound of pure fear directed at her. That was the root of it all, the belief, seared into her as a child, that the wolf within was a destructive, uncontrollable monster. She had caged it not just to hide from the world, but to protect the world from herself. Her entire identity was built on that single defining trauma. Hide the monster, suppress the beast, pretend to be small, fragile, and human. Kale's words from the training ground echoed in the silence of her mind. You're not weak, you're afraid of yourself. She had thought he was being cruel, but now she saw the devastating truth in it. Her fear wasn't a shield, it was a prison. It had kept her weak. It had made her a victim. It had led them here, to this cold stone floor, to this final, pathetic end. Valerius was going to win because she had refused to embrace the most powerful part of herself. A strange, quiet clarity began to settle over her. What was she so afraid of now? Death. Valerius would give her that. Losing Kale? She was already losing him. The fading of the bond. It was almost gone. All her worst fears were already happening. The cage of fear was meaningless now because the world outside it had already crumbled. She looked at Kale's still form, at the faint, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He had fought for her, bled for her, and was dying for her. He had seen the power in her that she had refused to see in herself. Her choice, whispered moments ago, felt hollow. Choosing him was meaningless if she had no power to back it up. The monster she had kept chained for so long. What if it wasn't a monster? What if it was a weapon? What if it was their only hope? It was a terrifying thought, a leap of faith into the abyss she had spent her life avoiding. To willingly unchain the beast, to invite the agony and the fire, to risk losing herself completely to the feral power she had always feared. But the alternative was to do nothing, to let Kale die, to let their bond vanish forever. In the deepest, darkest moment of her soul, with everything lost, she finally made a new choice. She would not die as a frightened girl in a cage. She looked at the obsidian wall, at the shadows in the corner, and she embraced the terror. A single, resolute whisper escaped her lips, a promise to the beast within and a vow to the man she would not lose. No more hiding. Chapter 19. The Wolf Awakens. Her whisper, "No more hiding," was not a prayer. It was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for a decade. Alara closed her eyes, and for the first time, she did not push the wolf down. She did not fight it, fear it, or shame it. She reached for it. She called to it. And from the deepest, most wounded part of her soul, it answered. The change was not the chaotic, agonizing eruption she remembered from childhood. This time, it was a choice. It began as a spark of heat in her core, a fire that spread through her veins not with pain, but with a feeling of impossible, explosive release. A decade of suppression, of cowering and pretending, unwound in a single breathtaking moment. Her bones did not just break, they flowed, lengthening and reshaping with a fierce, burning grace. Her senses exploded outward. She could hear the frantic heartbeat of a mouse in the castle walls, smell the distant snow on the highest mountain peak, and see the individual motes of dust dancing in the sliver of moonlight from the window. Power, raw and immense, flooded her being. It was a tidal wave, and for a terrifying second, she feared she would drown in it. But then she remembered Kale's dying form beside her, and her purpose became an anchor in the storm. Save him. The power solidified, coalescing around that single, desperate thought. When she opened her eyes again, the world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. She looked down, not with human eyes, but with the intelligent, piercing gaze of a wolf. She saw paws where her hands had been. But the fur... It wasn't the dark, common color she had always imagined. It was silver, a luminous, breathtaking silver that seemed to drink the moonlight and radiate a soft, ethereal glow of its own. She was a creature of legend, a myth made real in a filthy dungeon cell. The obsidian wall, which had dampened her and Kale's power, began to crack under the sheer force of her new aura. Thin, spiderwebbing fractures spread across its surface as her pure, untainted energy overwhelmed its dark magic. This was what she had been so afraid of, this incredible strength, this sublime, terrifying beauty. It wasn't a monster. It was her, the real her, all of her, liberated at last. Turning her new, powerful form, she looked at Kyle. He was still so faint, so close to the edge. The fading ember of their bond met the roaring bonfire of her new power, and for the first time, she was the one feeding its strength. She nudged his face with her muzzle, a silent promise. The flimsy, rusted bars of the cell door were an insult. With a single, effortless lunge, she smashed through them, the metal twisting and shrieking as if it were wet clay. She was free, and she would not leave him behind. Her vow was a silent, silver howl in the depths of her soul. She would save him, and then she would rain down hell upon the ones who had hurt him. Chapter 20. The Alpha's Voice. The guards in the corridor froze, their jaws slack with disbelief and awe. They had been guarding a broken prince and his human pet. Now, a luminous silver wolf, a creature from the oldest legends, stood before them, radiating an aura of command that rooted them to the spot. Alara ignored them. With a gentleness that belied her immense power, she nudged Kale, urging him, before carefully taking his chained arm in her jaws and pulling him from the cell. She dragged him through the winding corridors of Valerius's keep, a silver phantom on a rescue mission. She found a secluded chamber, smashed the silver chains that bound him, and then focused, forcing the change back. The shift to human form was clumsy, draining, but she did it. She stood naked and shivering, but filled with a new, unshakable resolve. She found a discarded cloak and covered herself before tending to Kale, forcing a trickle of water between his lips. It was then that Kale's generals, led by the grizzled Lycan, burst into the room. They had staged a desperate rescue attempt, only to find their target had already escaped. They stopped short, staring first at their wounded prince and then at the girl they had all dismissed. But she was different now. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a steel that had been forged in the dark. Valerius has him, Lycan growled, his gaze fixed on Kale. We were too late. No, you're not, Alara said, her voice clear and strong. It didn't waver. It commanded attention. Valerius believes he has won. He thinks our prince is broken and that his pack is leaderless. He's arrogant, and that's how we'll beat him. The hardened warriors stared at her. Who was this girl to speak of strategy? "And who will lead us?" one of the visiting alphas scoffed. "You?" "Yes," Alara replied without hesitation. She stood straighter, meeting his gaze. The memory of her silver form, of the power she now wielded, gave her an authority that transcended rank. "You've been waiting for a sign, for a leader to rally behind. Kyle is the rightful prince, and I am his mate. The legends say a silver wolf is a sign of the fate's favor. I am that sign. We will not wait for Valerius to finish his ritual. We will not cower. We will take the fight to him. We will take back our prince's life and his throne. Now." Her words, simple and raw, filled the room. They were a challenge, a promise, a call to arms. The alphas and generals exchanged uncertain glances, but they saw the unwavering fire in her eyes. They had felt the shift in power. From the doorway, a weak, rasping voice spoke a single word. "Listen." Every head turned. Kyle was awake, propped up against the doorframe, his body weak, but his golden eyes blazing with an emotion that struck Alara to the core. Pride. He was watching her, not as the girl he'd rescued, not as the liability he'd protected, but as the leader she had just become. He saw his queen. Chapter 21. The march of the mates. Kale's single word of endorsement was all it took. The doubt in the room evaporated, replaced by a surge of fierce, renewed loyalty. With their prince awake, and his fated mate radiating a power they had only heard of in stories, hope was rekindled. A plan was forged, not by generals alone, but with Alara's fierce, intuitive strategies guiding them. She was no longer a pawn, she was a player, and her voice was shaping the future of their world. The call to arms went out. Within hours, the mountain fortress, which had been a place of despair, was now a buzzing hive of war preparation. The clang of steel on steel, the low growls of anticipation, the scent of a pack gathering for battle. It was a symphony of impending conflict. Alara stood on a balcony overlooking the courtyard, Kale at her side. He was still pale, his side bandaged, but he stood tall, his strength seemingly drawn from her own. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "A silver wolf," he murmured, his voice filled with a sense of wonder that eclipsed all the pain they had endured. "I searched for a mate, and I found a legend." "You found a girl who was hiding," she replied softly, her gaze meeting his. "You helped her stop." In that moment, a warmth spread through her chest, but it was different from before. The bond, which had faded to a near-nothingness in the dungeon, now flared to life. It wasn't the painful, demanding fire it had once been. This was a new sensation, a deep, powerful current of shared strength, of absolute unity. It was the feeling of two halves finally becoming whole, not by a mark, but by a shared purpose. It surged between them, a river of power, clear and strong and endless. They were no longer fighting it, or each other. They were embracing it. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the mountains, the army began its march. It was a river of dark fur and glinting steel, flowing down the mountainside with a silent, deadly purpose. At its head walked a wounded prince and his silver-fated mate. They moved as one, their steps in sync, their shoulders brushing. The bond between them was a tangible thing now, a golden cord of light that only they could see, pulsing with their shared resolve. They marched through the twilight, the only sounds the crunch of their feet on stone and the low, rumbling growls of hundreds of wolves ready for war. The air grew colder, sharper, as they entered the blighted lands controlled by Valerius. The very trees here seemed twisted and sick. The scent of their enemy was on the wind, a foul smell of corruption and ambition. They stopped at the crest of a ridge, looking down upon Valerius's fortress, a dark spike of rock against the bruised purple sky. The battle was coming. War was here. Alara stood beside Kale, no longer a girl who smelled of lies, but a queen ready to fight for her king, their bond singing a song of imminent victory. Chapter 22. The Silver Queen. The battle was a maelstrom of claws and fury. Valerius's fortress grounds became a churning sea of struggling Lycan forms, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood and the savage sounds of war. At its heart, two alphas fought for the future of the packs. Kyle, still not at his full strength, met Valerius in a clash that shook the earth. It was a brutal, desperate duel, and Kyle was losing. Valerius, fueled by ambition and unburdened by injury, pressed his advantage, his silver-tipped claws slashing through Kyle's defenses. Seeing Kale stumble, a bloody gash opening on his chest was the only catalyst Alara needed. She didn't hesitate. She embraced the fire within and let her silver wolf self erupt into being. She was not a soldier in the fray. She was a silver bolt of lightning. She moved with a speed and grace that was otherworldly, a blur of moonlight and death. She slammed into Valerius, her fangs sinking into his shoulder and tearing him away from Kale. The fight shifted. It was no longer a duel. It was a dance of two mates fighting as a single, seamless entity. Kale, buoyed by her strength, rallied. He anticipated her moves, she his, their bond a silent, perfect form of communication on the battlefield. Together they were unstoppable. Alara, with her impossible speed, created an opening, and Kale, with his raw power, took it, ending Valerius's treasonous ambition with a final definitive strike. But as their enemy fell, the cost of the battle became terrifyingly clear. The violent surge of alpha power, the proximity to death, and the triumphant roar of their bond finally sealing its victory in combat was too much. The curse, which had been held at bay, descended upon Kale. A vacant, feral glaze filmed over his golden eyes. A low, mindless snarl ripped from his throat as he turned, no longer seeing his mate but only another creature in his territory. The madness was taking him. This was the final test, the moment of truth. Alara knew what she had to do. As Kale lunged, lost to the curse, she did not meet him as a wolf. In a wrenching, painful move, she forced herself back into her human form, meeting his snarling face with her own. She used the last of her strength to slam him to the ground, pinning him beneath her, a shocking reversal of their first night in the alley. His thrashing was wild, the mind of the prince gone. "Kale! I'm not losing you!" she screamed, her voice raw. She leaned down, ignoring the snapping of his fangs. She would not let the curse win. Fate had presented a riddle, and she had finally found the answer. With a cry that was part agony and part love, she sank her own teeth into the flesh of his shoulder. She didn't just mark him. She poured her own essence, the pure, untainted magic of the silver wolf, into him through the bite. It was a cleansing fire, a torrent of light flooding the darkness of the curse. The backlash was immense, a wave of raw power that threw her back. The last thing she saw before darkness took her was the feral madness receding from Kale's eyes, replaced by his own shocked, weary gaze. They collapsed together on the blood-soaked earth, victorious and alive. Chapter 23. The Unspoken Vow. Alara woke slowly, the scent of healing herbs replacing the stench of battle. She was in a lavish tent, laid upon a bed of soft furs. The war was over. The sound outside was not of fighting, but of a victorious army tending to its wounded. She sat up, her body aching, and saw Kale sitting in a chair watching her. He was bandaged, weary, but his eyes were clear. The curse was broken. He was sane. "You're okay," she breathed, a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her. He stood and came to her side, kneeling before her. He took her hands in his. "The curse." Lyra explained it. It was a poison that activated upon the finality of a royal marking. But it never anticipated a power like yours. The legends are unclear, but it seems the magic of a silver wolf is a purifier. You didn't just mark me, Alara. You healed me. You healed my entire bloodline. His voice was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. Sheer, unadulterated reverence. She had not just saved him, she had saved his future, his children, his entire legacy. She had rewritten their fate. In the days that followed, as their army marched home, the whispers that trailed her were no longer of scorn or curiosity. They were whispers of awe, She was not the prince's pet or his liability. She was the An Fawil Ergid, the Silver Wolf, their savior, their queen. The Lycans, who respected power above all else, looked at her with a new, profound respect. She had proven herself not just as a mate, but as a leader of immense and legendary power. One evening, as they made camp, she let the wolf out, needing to feel the freedom of her own skin. She lay on a ridge overlooking the valley, the moonlight bathing her silver fur in a celestial glow. Kale approached, not with the caution of a man approaching a beast, but with the quiet comfort of a man approaching his other half. He sat beside her, his hand gently stroking the fur on her back. He didn't need to say anything. She could feel his emotions through the newly healed, vibrant bond between them. Gratitude, love, a sense of peace so deep it felt like the mountain itself. He saw all of her now, the girl, the woman, the wolf, and he loved every part. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the soft fur behind her ear. His whisper was not a claim of ownership, but a quiet, deeply felt vow of belonging, a final acceptance of their shared soul. Mine. Chapter 24. A New Dawn. Months later, Alara stood on the great balcony of the mountain fortress, Kale's arms securely around her waist. The lands below were peaceful, the packs united and thriving under their new dual leadership. The scars of Valerius's rebellion were healing, and a new era of hope had begun. She was no longer dressed in a waitress's apron or in silks that felt like a costume. She wore a simple but elegant gown of deep forest green, practical enough to move in, beautiful enough for a queen. Her confidence was a quiet, steady flame, a natural part of her now. The great hall behind them was no longer a place of tension and whispers, but of celebration. She was not just respected, she was loved. She had brought with her a strength and a wisdom that tempered Kale's raw power, and together they were better than either had been alone. She was the silver moon to his golden sun, a perfect, fated balance. "Do you ever miss it?" Kyle asked softly, his gaze on the distant human towns nestled in the valley. The quiet life? The diner? Alara considered it for a moment, the memory of the clattering plates and the scent of burnt coffee feeling like a lifetime ago. "I miss the peace," she admitted, "but it wasn't my life. It was a place to hide. I was a ghost, pretending I didn't deserve to be real." She turned to him, her hand coming up to cup his jaw. "You dragged me out of the shadows, Kyle. It was terrifying, but you showed me who I really was." "You," he said, his voice full of emotion as he leaned into her touch, "showed me who I could be. Not just a prince defined by a curse, but a man worthy of a queen." The core question that had haunted her for so long was finally answered. A girl who hid from her identity, who ran from her fate, could not only be chosen, she could be the one to choose back, to seize her own power and rewrite the story. She had been chosen by a bond she didn't want, and in the end, she had claimed that bond on her own terms, with a power uniquely her own. From a terrified girl who hid her wolf and her heart, she had become a powerful woman who embraced both. Kale leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss filled with the promise of 1,000 peaceful tomorrows. It was not the desperate, hungry kiss of their past, but the sure, steady kiss of two souls who had found their home. As they stood together, watching the sun set over their kingdom, it was clear this was not an ending. It was a new dawn,